welcome everybody. We're excited to have you join us for these two panels today. We're going to kick things off in just a second, but first I want to hand things over to Bruce Berman of the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding, who's going to give us our overview and introduction.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be. We're in multiple time zones today. I am Bruce Berman. I'm co-moderator today with Chris Bush, and I'm chairman of the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding, and we're an independent nonprofit that facilitates intellectual property awareness. The novel coronavirus, okay, I just lost my, sorry about that. The novel coronavirus has been with us for barely 9 months, yet its impact has been felt by every person in every nation in the world. Viruses are notoriously difficult to understand and manage. The flu is caused by a virus, as is Ebola and the common cold, and a number of viruses can cause cancer. Even if COVID-19 were to disappear tomorrow, many of the changes it has wrought at home and in the workplace would remain. If infection rates continue to increase, or if the virus mutates, differences will multiply. The goal of today's discussion is to better understand the changes wrought by COVID thus far and identify what still needs to be accomplished to provide a confidence level in and around the workplace. For this, leadership in policy, innovation, entrepreneurship, and intellectual property is needed. This live stream is less about living with COVID than living with the impact of it. COVID-19 has presented formidable challenges, but it also has provided an opportunity to rethink ways we have been doing things. Innovative uses of data and analytics will play a significant role. CIPU and the Institute for Business Innovation have invited a diverse group of forward thinkers. They are not disease experts. They are experts in areas such as policy, architecture, entrepreneurship, investing, and law. Their perspective about the impacts of the pandemic is part of an essential dialogue. For today, each panelist will have 7 minutes to provide, 6 or 7, or 8 maybe in some cases, to provide a view of COVID from where they sit. The presentations will be followed by moderator questions, and then you, the audience, will have a chance to query panelists. Please use the chat function on your Zoom platform to provide your questions at any time. There will be a 5-minute break between panels. Chris?
Thank you, Bruce. I also want to welcome everybody on behalf of the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business and the Institute for Business Innovation. We have a great first panel today. I'm going to give a really brief 1-sentence introduction of each of our 4 panelists. And if you look in the chat box for Zoom, you'll find a link to our website, which has their full bios for if you would like to get more information. So to start things off, we are going to have Daniel Gerstein, who's a senior policy research with the RAND Corporation. He previously served as acting undersecretary and deputy secretary in the Science and Technology Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security from 2011 through 14. Our second panelist, Charles Cicchetti, is an economist and the managing director at the Berkeley Research Group. He previously served as the chair of the Wisconsin Public Service Commission and has been a professor at several top universities in the country. Our third speaker will be Randy Howder, principal and co-managing director of the San Francisco office for Gensler, a global design and architecture firm. One of his primary focuses is on new approaches to workplace design. And then our fourth speaker and final panelist for the first panel is Daniel Marty, who's head of global public policy and public affairs for the RELX group. He previously served as a senior White House official during the Obama administration, leading IP enforcement efforts. So with that, I want to turn it over to Daniel Gerstein to start us off. Daniel will give you 7 minutes to make your initial presentation. Oh, Daniel, we're not able to hear you.
think you're muted, Dan.
Yeah, I think you're muted. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Sorry about that. So I have three major topics that I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to first start out very quickly with economic winners and losers, and then turn our discussion to what have we actually learned about our economy, and then finally end up with what are the likely long-term economic impacts that we're going to see from COVID. So the first thing I'd like to do is just introduce the topic and say, I'd like to say that this is a once in a generation event. But unfortunately, the last 20 years have told us with West Nile virus, SARS and MERS, two other coronaviruses, H1N1, Ebola and Zika, and now COVID, that we are far more likely to see this occur in the future as well. I think we're at an incredible inflection point. We will measure much of the rest of certainly the next decade or two in terms of pre-COVID and post-COVID. And we're seeing great societal and economic disruption. So let me turn to the economic winners and losers. And what I've done is I've kind of taken a look at what I call the winners, those things that have gained momentum during this period, some that are too soon to tell, and then some losers that are starting to emerge. And these may come as no surprise, but anything having to do with communications and anything, whether it's telework or telemedicine or teleeducation, social media and smartphones, broadband comms, and even augmented and virtual reality. In terms of science and technology, I see other winners, the research and development, biotech in particular, learning about the virus, and society actually learning about the virus. We're also starting to see more and more with artificial intelligence and autonomous and robotic systems. We're also seeing winners in enhanced services like delivery anything or personal supply chains that wind up terminating at our front door. So where is it too soon to tell? I'd say large scale gatherings, and that includes scientific and academic conferences and other higher education, government institutions. Think about the state and local governments. They are under some enormous stress right now. The Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also too soon to tell how they're going to fare. And then in spending, the defense budget, which was approaching $750 billion, where will that wind up? And how about cybersecurity? We have a lot of work going on the internet, but the cybersecurity perhaps has not kept pace. Things having to do with economic self-sufficiency, like 401ks and IRAs, and then health and medicine, too soon to tell where we'll wind up. What are some of the losers? Tourism and travel, including local transportation systems, airlines, cruise industries, brick and mortar establishments. We're seeing this play out as stores and restaurants and gyms and movie theaters and hotels are under enormous stress. Many may not recover. And then other service industries such as Uber and Lyft. So what have we learned about our economy? Well, the first thing is that there's a true disconnectedness between Wall Street and Main Street, and it's playing out with great effect on a daily basis. We also know that our economy lacks resilience. It has been designed for efficiency over preparedness, and therefore, our just-in-time logistics system is demonstrating that it does not work in a pandemic. And in fact, if you're going to have a just-in-time inventory system and you get an unforeseen disruption, it makes making rapid and critical decisions even that much more important. Also, global supply chains. There's a lot of talk now about decoupling and making the US more self-sufficient with regard to some key areas and decoupling our supply chains. And what I would say is I'm not sure that that's possible. I'm not sure it's going to be feasible. Certainly the first step is gaining end-to-end visibility of what our supply chains are made up of. Why do I say it might not be possible? I mean, even today we're experiencing severe shortages in PPE, personal protective equipment, to include N95 masks, and we're over 9 months into this. You know, there are some parts of our system that we can only source from international partners. There's a special tree that grows in the Andean region, particularly in Chile, and it's used as an adjuvant for vaccines, that is to stimulate the immune response. And we're not going to be able to necessarily recreate that anytime soon. You know, one survey looked at companies, and 95% of the companies have been impacted by COVID. Only 56% had a plan to address disruptions from China. 32% took more than a month to recover, and only 27% actually had visibility into their supply chains. So what are the long-term economic impacts? The first one I would say is we're seeing an acceleration of the move to the future economy, that is the future of work. And we're starting to see areas where it's going to make more sense to have automation, robotics, artificial intelligence begin to take over for humans. We're also
Sorry
seeing—
to interrupt, just a quick note, well, you've got about 1 more minute.
Okay. The definition of critical infrastructure has also changed. Nobody would have predicted at the beginning of COVID that things like supermarkets and beef and pork processing plants and educators and education systems would become part of our critical infrastructure. And then long-term effects. And here I think we really have to pause. The recovery, if previous recoveries are any indication, is 10 to 20 years. Some businesses are likely never to recover. We have incredible deficit spending right now, with over $3 trillion directly to the stimulus, and our GDP in the second quarter is 32% down. We have the small businesses that will not recover. We also have increased homelessness, almost 500,000 more homeless to deal with. And we have long-term sequelae. It's going to be very, very costly to deal with people who have experienced COVID and are now having to be taken care of, perhaps some for life. And I think there are also some significant mental health issues that we're going to have to deal with long term. One final note. So some people have said COVID was a black swan event, and I really push back on that, because a black swan event is one that is unforeseen. This sort of spillover from animals to humans are likely to continue well into the future. And the best way to deal with the pandemic is before it starts. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Daniel. And now we'll move to Charles Cicchetti, if you can unmute yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about what I call the obstacles and the headwinds that are slowing the return to normalcy and anything like full economic recovery. And in doing so, I'm going to discuss them into 3 buckets. So I'm going to talk about legal and regulatory issues, some economic issues, and some health-related issues. So from the standpoint of legal and regulatory matters, what are the things that we sometimes talk about, but mostly give short shrift, is liability. If people are going to return to the workplace, an employer is going to have responsibility for maintaining certain health and safety standards to protect employees in a world with COVID-19 still affecting and infecting people. And so that's really an important issue. The current debate going on the second phase of congressional response has liability built into it. We don't know if anything's going to pass. We don't know what will happen about that liability issue. But to be sure, businesses that have workers coming into office buildings, coming into space of any kind indoors, are going to have to deal with the liability issue. A second related issue is privacy. We don't just have to deal with that as individuals, but businesses have to deal with issues related to how are they going to trace, how are they going to contact, and people who might be exposed? How are we going to let people know? How is that all going to take place? Will there be one standard, or will each county in the nation literally come under the health officials in that county? And that's a major issue. Another legal and regulatory issue is we've kept schools mostly shuttered. And there's some bright spots that there's some return to schools and in-person learning, but schools play an important childcare role. And without schools being available essentially under a normal schedule, that childcare burden is going to be particularly hard felt among low-income individuals who have no options to return to at least one spouse and a two-spouse family to the workplace. There are major displacements that are related to it. Another legal and regulatory issue is how will spacing and testing actually take place in the workplace? Again, particularly in an office space setting. If we start to return to office, how will we redesign things? You'll hear that from some of the other speakers, but how will these things be organized? And if there are different rules in different locations, but varying by state, maybe even varying by county within a state, how will those be accomplished and addressed by businesses who have to make those decisions? Let me turn to some of the economic issues that I see out there. One of the issues is actually optimistic. It's new technologies. Technologies like what we're participating in today with Zoom calls and similar products. Technologies that are related to avoiding travel and being able to continue to function. Technology doesn't really work that well if we're talking about manufacturing and many blue collar jobs where you have to physically be present to do certain things, but it certainly affects the way businesses might organize, academics might evolve in the future. And it's one of those issues that is certainly going to change what we think of as a return to normal, because I doubt we're going to get the normal return to the way things were just 2 years ago in terms of what technology offers. We also have changing preference. And these changing preferences where people, even if their business that they work for is returning to normal, may cause them to lead to become independent contractors so they can avoid having to return to work and would instead choose to rely on these new technologies that are available to avoid doing so. If we have more independent contractors as a solution to how individuals decide how to react to a call to return to an office, for example, how will that change the way benefits are determined and who gets benefits? Because independent contractors aren't protected the same way employees are. And so there are those kind of issues. And there's a reluctance to return to work. Some businesses and even businesses in other countries as well are paying inducement pay to get the people who are hesitant to return to work be rewarded for doing so, and something in the range of $50 to $75 a day to make up for the fact that you now have to return to a world where you have to keep your clothes in a certain business professional sense, pay for lunches, pay for commuting, pay for childcare. So those kind of incentives to get people back to work are certainly out there. Let me turn now to the health-related issues. Bad science, I think, and I've explained this in other contexts, looks to the number of cases which are a function of the amount of tests. The real health-related issue should be, what about hospitalizations? What about symptomatic infections as opposed to infection rates? What about the difference of the disease and its likelihood of becoming infected, as well as how you respond to that infection, how your body responds to it based upon your age? And therefore, how does this affect the way we adopt rules for returning to work? How much will businesses take these into account? How much will individuals take these into account? These health-related issues that go much beyond the simple-minded idea of looking at tests or number of infections that are positive in those tests without taking into account the true health effects, like are you symptomatic? Are you likely to be symptomatic? What is your risk of death? What is your risk of hospitalization? These are really important issues that I think we'll start to think about as the world starts to begin the process, which I think will be relatively slow, of returning to business as usual. The numbers of the economy may look good, and they may continue to improve, and I suspect they will. But the actual return to what we were doing as little as a year ago, those are the questions that I'm trying to get you to address.
Charlie, sorry to interrupt you. You've got about 1 more minute left.
Okay, I'm almost done. So there's also some major uncertainty that's out there that is slowing things down. And I think we should be mature and address them. One is some states are changing the rules of what it takes to be recovering, what it takes to open up. That creates uncertainty that businesses can't plan ahead. They have to be prepared to deal with the fact that not only may states change rules, but counties may reject the state change and adopt their own set of rules in place of them. And then there's also the new issue, which I think is a growing fear of vaccines. I understand politics. I love politics. I embrace politics. But the debate over vaccines is certainly creating a new fear. And without vaccines giving the reassurance both to individuals as well as their colleagues, we have a very strong blowback or pushback on the issue of returning to normal. With that, thank you. And I'm also joined Dan and looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. Next, we're going to go to Randy Howder. Randy, I know you've got some slides to share. Would you like to go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, can you all see my screen?
I can, thank you.
Yeah, so as the only designer in the crowd, I'm the one with the visuals, but you know, as Dan and Charlie both alluded to, the sort of future of work and its uncertainty is sort of key part of the discussion today. And when I say work in this context, I obviously am referring to people who generally have worked in offices. I recognize there's a whole segment of the economy of people who don't have that kind of place of work. But I think the fundamental thing that's happened as we all are working from our home offices or wherever is that this notion of work and workplace has been forever altered. And our company is the largest design firm in the world. And we like to say we went from 55 offices around the world on March 12th to 5,500 the following Monday. And I think most companies and most individuals have found this transition actually somewhat easier than they thought. Overnight, we learned new behaviors, technologies. It's said that this has accelerated the adoption of workplace technologies by 5 to 10 years, as kind of Dan alluded to. Now that we're all in this work from home, and as Charlie said, we're kind of starting to come back in different ways, depending on regions, that future is probably forever altered, and it will be different for each company, each location, each culture. Our own research says that people want to go back to the office. This survey was taken back at the beginning of the summer. We're about to release another version of it this week, but it says still the majority of people actually want the office to be their primary place of work. But a significant and growing portion have gotten used to some of the productivity enhancements of being at home and the flexibility of being with their families. Interestingly, the people who want to go back to the office the most are actually the sort of millennials and younger, because they're craving that sort of mentorship, you know, connection with friends and colleagues. That's a significant part of their development as young professionals. And they also lack the resources generally and the living conditions to have a nice home office or even proper internet connectivity. We see the sort of managers, middle managers and above being the most comfortable kind of being at home most often. But regardless, people miss human contact. It's the people that they miss. It's the people they come into the office for, and they're finding it harder despite all of these wonderful tools that we've all adopted to collaborate and stay up to speed on what's happening in the office. But what we're seeing is probably going to be adopted is this new era of choice and autonomy. And we're thinking about it in sort of this 5-5-5 scale. So a significant number of people come to the office 5 days per week. A significant number will come 5 days per month. And a growing and significant number will come just 5 days per year. And so companies need to plan for that entire range, and the success, the competitive advantage going forward will be the way in which they adopt that flexibility as a means to empower their workforce. And this intertwines with the other conversations we've been having about racial equity over the summer, that this recognizing people are different, they come from different backgrounds, they have different family situations and they're different at different points in their personal lives, allowing for that to happen in the context of an office, and de-emphasizing that sort of presenteeism, and focusing on experience, right? So not going back to the way things were, but thinking about the employee experience as the sort of key at the center, and connecting that experience across place, technology, and people. And so a couple of just slides. I have a much longer presentation. I can certainly follow up with many of you if you're interested of sort of what does this future look like. It's about starting at home and recognizing that the home is becoming more of an office, and the office will also become more of a home, and how those two are connected through AI or the notion of a digital twin that connects those two and enables a different kind of collaboration, allowing people to kind of drop in virtually to the office, connecting that experience of someone working from home with someone working from the office, and equalizing and making that seamless is sort of the name of the future. When we do go back to the office, what's the nature of how that transforms? How does technology start to infuse that virtual and physical collaboration without prioritizing one over the other? How does space become much more flexible, because we're going to be dealing with different waves of populations depending on the day of the week, time of the year, what's going on in projects and teams. And then most importantly, the things that we're all dealing with right now, virtual conferencing, when a subset of people are now back in the office, but a subset of people are still at home, how do we equalize that experience? And I think we're seeing a lot of innovation coming out of companies around mixed reality, virtual reality, and augmented reality. How is that going to transform how we actually meet and work together in both physical and virtual space? It's really exciting, and I think we'll see a lot of growth to eliminate the sort of screen fatigue that we're all experiencing now, and deal with the ways that humans actually process information and body signals, body language, to sort of make those interactions more seamless. And then the whole conversation, as we've all been eating in outdoor restaurants, how does that thinking of health and wellness and airflow start to infuse the design of our buildings? Back in the 1920s, it was actually the tuberculosis epidemic that created what we now know as modern architecture. The sort of cleanliness, clean lines and visibility and glass and natural light was a direct response to a previous pandemic in Europe. How does that start to change how we think about our office space and our buildings and cities themselves? And so, the big question for our clients is, what does this mean for the future of real estate? Are we going to need more space, less space? The jury is out, and it's probably going to be really different depending on the organization. Right now, we know most space is devoted to individual concentration. And in the future, as we go forward, that may be a different equation. It may be repurposed campuses in places like Silicon Valley that are more intentional about collaboration, and most of that focused work happens elsewhere. It could be community outposts in neighborhoods or satellite cities that have a greater balance of space types. It means different things for amenities and how companies provide for their employees and build culture, how they connect.
Sorry to interrupt, but you have one more minute.
Yep, one more slide, I think. And so, what we're really seeing is the shifting of operating models within our companies. And so facilities and real estate used to really kind of control the employee experience, but now it really is going to take this really integrated ecosystem of HR, IT, and other product teams themselves, enabling collaboration through the technology that the company itself is creating for the outside world. So how are people at Facebook working differently because they can connect through their own platforms differently? And so that's really sort of where we are with thinking through the future of work and all of the implications that this has brought upon us. And so I'm happy to, as everyone has said, take your questions after the next panelist.
Thank you, Randy. Really interesting. We're going to finish off our first set of panel presentations with Danny Marty. Danny, we'll hand it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to speak for the next few minutes about the role of intellectual property, IP, in facilitating solutions. IP is not often well understood, and in fact, I would argue is often misunderstood in the best of times. So, this pandemic certainly reinforces why it's important that we understand the role of IP policy in the greater discussion around innovation policy. IP policy has long served as a catalyst to innovation by supporting investments, both in time and money, in such things as technology, medicines, and other products or items. Before I jump into the specific COVID context, let me highlight just a few examples of how IP supports investments, jobs, and fair trade. I think, as hopefully all of you know, intellectual property is comprised of several different rights, including trademark, copyrights, patents, and trade secrets. Admittedly, the pandemic is largely focusing around patent, but let me just spend a few minutes and talk about some of the other rights and how it colors and influences a larger discussion. If we take the more kind of tangible IP right of trademarks, right, this IP right works to protect the rights holder and consumer alike. The brand is a symbol of trust. It tells people who you are. And of course, we pride ourselves in being able to make informed decisions of what we buy or what we consume, and thus we rely on trademarks throughout the day. If I purchase an Apple charger, I expect it to be an Apple charger and to be safe, not catch on fire, etc. If we allow people other than Apple to use the same logo and pass off their own product as being from Apple, you could quickly see how that act of imitation is unfairly usurping and trading off the investments and value that Apple created. One company makes the investment while the other one seeks to usurp that value. This is unfair competition, not to mention illicit trade in counterfeit goods in this trademark example. On the copyright front, a movie studio may invest $200 million to create, advertise, and distribute a movie. But if another person can merely copy it and begin to profit from it, the original investment, one that was already risky to begin with, right? After all, how many movies fail, becomes largely unsustainable. On the patent side, things do get a little more technical, but I would argue that similar notions are at play. Patent law seeks to recognize the innovator, and under patent law, the individual inventor can stand in the same position as the largest of companies. If one person invents something and someone else can just take it, we quickly descend to a dog-eat-dog world where invention, creation, or creativity is no longer rewarded, but rather how fast one can steal from another and commercialize it for one's own gain. In this dog-eat-dog world of unprotected investments, it hardly supports a robust innovation cycle that in bio or life sciences, as an example, requires billions of dollars in investments in human capital, partnerships, education, manufacturing facilities, etc. Another reason patent law works is because it's premised on sharing of knowledge, as compared to a trade secret that is not. Patent disclosures disclose the invention so that others are able to make and use the invention from the information disclosed. All patents are published by the IP offices around the world, and as a result, these patent disclosures can and do provide inspiration and lessons for future innovators around the world. With this reliable IP system and the promise of protection down the line, inventors are willing to disclose their creation to the public. So this US IP model is, discussed in an admittedly crude summary, but it's this IP framework that forms part of our rule of law society, one that provides predictability and stability in a complex marketplace. Now, in a COVID context, the debate is certainly a more serious one, but I would argue it rests on the same principles, one where ingenuity is rewarded and where companies can make very expensive bets and not lose the entire business in the process. I see IP policy playing a silent and sometimes not so silent role in facilitating solutions to all sorts of problems. One cannot simply turn on or off this innovation engine in the time of emergency and walk away from longstanding rules-based market rules. In the COVID-19 context, we need our businesses to take on large financial risks now to ensure that a vaccine is ready to be distributed to the public as soon as it's proven safe and effective. We need to accelerate testing. We need to rapidly and safely upscale cell lines. We need to shift and increase manufacturing capacity for hundreds of millions and indeed billions of doses. This is the IP system that helps inventors and companies to make the investments of time, energy, and resources necessary to develop a commercial market or method. It's this prior investment and inventions that make possible a rapid response now, allowing researchers to jump in quickly using a variety of scientific techniques. Just in the closing minute or two, I think we should be concerned when we hear statements like IP is a barrier to innovation. I think the scale of private sector mobilization during the pandemic is unprecedented. And while IP rights may not be leading each and every advancement, it often serves as that silent partner or force that helps to drive much of the innovation around us. The evidence also shows that there are a number of voluntary actions being undertaken by many IP rights holders during this crisis, including innovative license agreements, the publication of scientific data on a free-to-use basis, the publication of scientific specifications that allow other manufacturers to piggyback on these learnings. And there are a number of partnerships around low-cost or nonprofit vaccine developments. I think all of this is contributing solutions at a time that it's critical that we have more and not less of them. Chris, back to you.
Great, and perfect timing, Danny. Thank you. So we're now going to move into about 10 minutes of general discussion between myself and the panelists and among the panelists. I did want to remind everybody that for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we are going to be opening it up to your questions. Please put your questions in the chat box for any of the panelists. And when we get to the Q&A in a few minutes, we'll go ahead and call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So with that, Danny, actually, I wanted to quickly just start with you on that IP front. I'm curious if you've seen any good examples. You mentioned right at the end of your presentation there, you know, some innovative licensing agreements that you've heard talk of, elements like that. How are you seeing the balance, especially during this coronavirus era, between openness and sharing and innovation versus the more, I guess, traditional closed IP system?
Yeah, Chris, I think the word balance in this respect is the one we're seeing the most in during the pandemic. I think all businesses across industries are realizing that we all need to be part of the solution, and perhaps we can worry about profits and losses later on. You still can't lose your shirt in the process, but everyone has to roll up their sleeves and do their part. And even out of the technology and life sciences space, you see, you know, hotel chains opening up their doors to medical professionals and first responders. That's what I mean in this kind of partnership in contributing. On the bio and life sciences, we've seen a number of companies enter into partnerships where they have pledged low-cost vaccines once we get there, or vaccines to be developed on a non-for-profit basis. J&J, for example, had one such example, but everything from Pfizer to Merck. Company at RELX, one of the RELX businesses is Elsevier, one of the leading scientific, technical, medical publishers. And although we received no government funding to do the peer and editorial review and hosting of the value-added version of the article that appears in our journals, we have partnered with NIH and the World Health Organization to make all of the articles that report on COVID or previous SARS research publicly available at no cost on public repositories, including hosted by the government at NIH and the World Health Organization. to try to make sure that we can also do our part to facilitate a solution.
Great, thank you, Danny. Dan Gerstein, I wanted to jump to you next and ask you the question, how do you find the right balance, or how do we as a society, I should say, find the right balance between managing coronavirus as well as future pandemic or climate risks with things like privacy concerns and damage to people's livelihoods? I know you addressed a little bit of that already in your presentation, but maybe if you can expand on that or talk about some of those trade-offs.
Well, that was a pretty complex question, but I think what you were asking initially was looking at disease and the human effects that are causing the disease to become more prevalent as the first part of that topic. And if I got that right, you're right on target. And that is that as humans begin to move out into non-traditional areas and as species begin to mix, we see more and more opportunities for the sorts of spillovers. So in my early remarks, when I talked about that litany of diseases, they're coming more frequently. And in fact, most of the diseases today that we're seeing, and certainly most of the viral diseases, are actually coming from a zoonotic source, that is from an animal source. And so that is really a problem that we're going to have to deal with. What was the second part of your question?
I was curious about managing those types of risks versus other human issues, like privacy concerns is obviously a big one when it comes to things like tracking in a coronavirus era.
Well, coming from the Department of Homeland Security, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the concept of risk. And, it's really funny, if you had to do all over again the coronavirus and you knew what was in store, you probably would have made different decisions. And one of those decisions was, for example, if the administration early on had said, everybody needs to wear a mask, and that if that had been said on the 13th of March, when we started to see the WHO declare certain things and, there were other actions taken, what would it have looked like today in the United States in terms of mortality and morbidity? And so making those decisions early on becomes very important. And what we're seeing is that you really don't get a lot of opportunity once things are moving in order to take advantage of that. Now, on issues such as privacy, it's a really interesting balance, right? I go through the discussion of risk to say that, with privacy right now, if you were to ask people what's more concerning to you, your temporary loss of privacy or being able to know and have contact tracing done if there was somebody who you might have been exposed to who had the virus or was asymptomatic or who had also been exposed to the virus. And, most people, when asked a question like that, would say, absolutely, I'm willing to give up my privacy in order to have contact tracing. But, then when you take the emergency out of the equation and you ask this, 2 years down the road, they say, well, I want my privacy back. And, the problem that we're encountering is that a lot of the technologies that we have ushered in are not going to readily leave our lives. I mean, we are going to be walking around with GPS enabled cell phones, and we are going to be able to be tracked. If you go in and get a genetic test done, we're going to track your DNA. I mean, we know this now from various cases. And so we should expect that we're going to have to learn to live in a world with a decreased ability to actually have privacy and remain, certainly, have your privacy, but going off the grid is going to be nearly impossible.
Great, thank you, Dan. Charlie, I wanted to check with you next. You mentioned in your talk about how some school districts are reopening, where definitely there aren't all reopening at this point, especially here in California. I'm curious if you've seen a lot of differences between how the pandemic has been handled at the local versus the national and international levels, And what are the both opportunities and threats from those differences when it comes to identifying risks and responses to the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, I think from a legal standpoint, the way in which we've declared the emergency is that we didn't do it at the national level. We did it at the state level, and then within states, we did it even at the county and the local level. And this matters when you start to untangle things, because you're not going to get one size fits all. In fact, I think it's sort of culturally something that we resist in this country, trying to have one size fits all. And the result is that you'll find that both opening up businesses as well as reopening schools, as well as opening bars and restaurants, and the things that seem to be particularly on people's current mind of what we need to do or think about doing, will have a different set of responses. And that makes the challenge and the costs of responding particularly challenging. But it also makes how we deal with a second wave or a new pandemic. We've learned a lot. We know that not everybody's at the same level of risk. We know that every circumstance is not the same. We see the debate last night having people be tested so they could walk around without masks. We see the NBA having testing. We see all sorts of changing rules and mindsets. And the question is, how much will people tolerate? And I think Daniel just made an excellent point, which is, in an emergency, and while we have confidence in public officials, and while we have confidence in a scientific answer, we're likely to do a lot. But when those things start to become unwound and change, and we see changing rules and conditions, and then people start to get more than restless. They tend to push back and not want to go forward with the same inspired and collective solutions that we embraced back in March and April, when we were told it's 2 weeks or it's maybe 4 weeks, but we weren't told it was going to be so many months. And now what we do next is going to be affected by the way people have learned from the recent past.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Randy, my next question is for you. You did a great job of sharing some of the lessons learned and some of the surveying that Gensler has been doing around office design and changes to office culture being driven and going forward. I'm wondering if you can address a little bit what other lessons learned you've had for how we can, as a society, more proactively and quickly identify and address risks and obstacles if a future pandemic or other event hits.
Yeah, and I apologize in advance. The neighbors are doing some leaf blowing, so if you hear that, I apologize. The beauty of working from home. Yeah, I think that what this has done, and the longer this has gone on, as Charlie said, I remember when we first left the office, it was like until about April 7th was when our sort of leadership said we would go back. And here we are, almost 7 months later. So I think the longer this goes on, the more kind of adaptable people are to kind of working from home, working from other locations. I think that, as I said, is going to be the kind of permanent change. I think this has made companies more resilient, office-based companies. There was, for a lot of companies, a great, they did not take kindly to kind of flexibility in working from home. I think that this is ultimately made it sort of more easy for companies to adapt if there's a second wave, if there's another pandemic, that many of these changes are permanent, and the ability to, I think the confidence this has given organizations that they actually have the wherewithal to keep their businesses moving forward, keep people productive, and in a lot of cases, I saw productivity go up. I think that's the main sort of driver of this. I think the other thing is and of course, there's going to be all the things Dan talked about with these technologies we're adapting are intruding further and further into our lives. And now that the home has become an office and the office has become a home, that blurring of the boundaries is problematic from a privacy perspective, as he noted. But that notwithstanding, I think on the corporate side, the company side, the ability to have that more seamless connection, all of the ubiquitous sort of cloud-based applications makes it so that companies can run their businesses from whenever or wherever. And so that kind of business continuity plan that every company had in place has sort of sprung into action, and we've learned how to deal with maybe a slower moving crisis than one that sort of is more of a natural disaster or a terrorist attack type, which I think was the last great disruption to work, was around September 11th. And just the adoption of technology, the ubiquity of these devices and cloud computing has, I think, forever changed our relationship to the workplace. And so I think the long-term question out there is, how will companies adapt to the sort of changing nature of our relationship to space? And will they still cluster in places like Silicon Valley or New York? And there's been a ton of articles and commentary about the move to sort of second-tier cities like Nashville and Denver and places like that, where it's more affordable. I think school enrollment in Lake Tahoe is up 300% this fall because so many people have left San Francisco. I saw that in an article this morning. So I think those are the changes out there. It remains to be seen if this is just a temporary reaction to sort of the disruption. Will people sort of go back? Will it go back to normal? That's the open question. And I think when the things like vaccines and other things give us that certainty that Charlie talked about, I think then only after that point will we be able to see if these sorts of changes are permanent. But it's no doubt that this is sort of, a 7-month disruption in kind of basic business operations. It's now kind of gone on too long to not be a permanent disruption in some way.
Great, thank you so much, Randy. I now want to open the audience, as well as if any of the panelists have questions to each other. Just a reminder for our audience, please go ahead and put any questions in the chat feature, and we'll go ahead and call on you. Randy, I am actually seeing a couple requests in the chat if you would be willing to share your slides. I don't know if those are available for public consumption.
Yeah, happy to share them. Yeah, they're for public consumption, so happy to share those. I don't know, Chris, you can send them out because I don't have people's individual contact info, or feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I can send them that way as well. Great, thanks, Randy. So we have a question in the chat from Richard Nugent. Richard, would you be able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hello. Good evening from Belfast, in the UK, Northern Ireland. The key question I have is, obviously this is an IP focused discussion, and really it's about government giving grants to all sorts of companies, not just health companies or hospitals, things like that. But are there in the US and maybe elsewhere where people are viewing this, are the governments giving grants to companies to help solve COVID-related problems? It could be often quite basic innovations, but are you seeing those sorts of innovations come through from those types of grants? Really, it's a fairly open question. Just interested to hear what the panel have to say on that type of topic.
Great, thank you, Richard. Any of our panelists want to jump in and address that one?
Yeah, I'll be happy to jump in at least first. Richard, thanks for the question. I think it's too early to say right now, what we're going to see coming out of the government issued funding and grant making. Certainly, we are trying to put everything that we have in our arsenal to use and see where the innovation comes from. Some of the government funding that has happened in the US has helped companies, for example, in the vaccine hunt, reallocate resources, rescale manufacturing facilities, start investing instead of one to invest in 4 different manufacturing facilities given the numbers of doses that we need. Something that just requires some additional government funding and financing to reduce any delay that might exist in the private sector, as we have all been hammered and having to retool, reallocate, reassess how we do business in the pandemic. So we have been seeing that. The US government has already granted hundreds of millions of dollars towards the search for a vaccine. Some of the monies that have been doled out have been in partnership. For example, one pharmaceutical company, the US government put in a few $100 million, while the other company had to put in $600 million in order to create one of those government finance partnerships. The government has also doled out money to, again, help spur the necessary changes and investments that need to be done to minimize downtime by pre-purchasing doses, still sight unseen, but having that additional financing come through at this time is also intended to accelerate the search.
I can add a couple things. This is Dan Gerstein. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has, through their Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has handed out a number of grants, and the grants are for a variety of purposes. They're everything from trying to assist in businesses being able to prepare to reopen. That is, many of them need to put up the barriers and such that allow for more safe interactions. I was going to mention the vaccines as well. I think it's almost $1.5 billion actually, in terms of the commitments that have been made and some of the joint ventures that have been started. The Defense Production Act has been invoked to try to stimulate companies, and that's not necessarily a grant per se, but it does give those companies certain benefits with respect to opening up and satisfying specific needs that the government has. The legislation that has been done by the Congress, the CARES Act, and there's a second or a larger stimulus that's being contemplated. That really has to help with the state and local governments, who are right now in very, very poor shape. And in fact, if they don't get relief shortly, are likely to have to get rid of essential services. And many of those essential services are really lifelines that are keeping people moving. Part of the CARES Act was actually handing out grants. I'll call them grants, but it was really paying people stipends so that they would, have money for food and other living expenses. So there's a lot of discussion that's already gone on. There's other discussion that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States, is contemplating.
Thank you, Daniel. We're almost out of time, but Bruce, did you have a final question that you wanted to ask this panel before we move on to the next? I do, actually. Thank you for offering this to me, Chris. I was wondering, China has apparently has done a uniquely good job in managing COVID. They've had their, Wuhan started down the wrong road, but they were able to recuperate. So did democracies like South Korea. I'm just wondering, is there an inherent strength in managing COVID if you're a more, how shall I say, authoritarian government? Dan Gerstein?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a lot embedded in there. So the first thing is that many of the countries that did very well can actually trace that lineage back to 2003 and the SARS disease. And what happened during SARS was all those countries like, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, they suffered greatly during SARS, and they were hit very hard. And so when they saw the early stages of this coronavirus, they immediately took measures. They went into the quarantine, social distancing, wearing of masks, and they did this so rapidly that they were able to really stop it before it got a hold in their countries. And of course, with travel shut down, that took additional pressures off of it. So that's part of what we see. I would make one comment about China, and I'm not being a China apologist, but I will say that I've taken the China response to SARS in 2003, and I put it on the same timeline as the COVID response of 2019. And lo and behold, they are about a month and a week better than they were back in 2003 in terms of talking to the World Health Organization. For example, they actually told the World Health Organization on the 31st of December that they had a problem. And they were trying to figure out what their problem was, but they knew they had a respiratory disease. They weren't sure how severe it was. And even you can't really expect them to have understood it at that point, because they had only really seen it for about 2.5, 3 weeks by that point, and they were still trying to characterize it. So it's really interesting when you lay out these timelines and try to identify what people knew, what countries knew, how they reacted, the measures they took in response.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. We're now going to wrap up our first panel. A big thank you to all of our panelists, all 4 of our panelists. I hope they're all going to be able to stick around, and maybe if you have any other questions at the end of the second panel, they'll be able to chime in again there as well. We're going to take a really brief 5-minute break to get the second group of panelists ready to go, and then we will start back up again 5 minutes from now at 11:38 California time, 2:38 East Coast time, if I'm doing the math correctly. And we hope you'll all stick around for these 5 minutes while we make the transition. Back to Bruce Berman at the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding to take us away with the second panel. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. We hope you all had a chance to stretch and take a breath or two before we jump into the second panel. I'm really excited to hear this group as well. And with that, let me hand it over to Bruce Berman to start it off.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. That was a terrific first panel. Very interesting. I had questions I wanted to ask, but I don't want to overstay my welcome. This panel will look more. The first panel was more focused on identifying some of the obstacles. This panel, ideally, is going to look at some of the developments currently being done or should be done, and how do we fund them? How do we get them to commercialization? Eric Brynjolfsson, an economist and director of the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford, said earlier this month, when it comes to remote work, the last 10 weeks have seen more changes than we've seen in the previous 20 years. Now, that might be overstating it a bit, but it's the point's well taken. COVID-19 has wrought changes in how we approach work, life, and education, and it will continue to. New products and services are needed to navigate these difficult waters. The panel you're about to hear will explore what is being done or can be done to develop and manage the impact of coronavirus and get the economy rolling. Some solutions will draw on advanced technology and science. Others will be surprisingly low tech. Many will rely on intellectual property rights like patents and trade secrets to obtain funding and commercialize products. Living with coronavirus does not mean giving up on a vaccine or cure. We hear a lot about so-called new normal, but we are learning that the new normal becomes old very quickly, evolves, with the number and nature of infections. The previous panel featured experts in policy, data, defense, architecture, economics, and environment. This panel will feature those engaged in inventing, entrepreneurship, investing, and law. And just to briefly introduce them, the full bios or fuller bios are on the website, the Haas Berkeley website, IBI website. But just briefly, Adam Mossoff, who will be leading us off today, is a professor of law at George Mason University at the Scalia School of Law, chairman of the IP Forum at the Hudson Institute, and he's a member of the board of directors of CIPU. Rhonda Shrader is executive director of the Berkeley Haas Entrepreneurship Program, and she's engaged with some very interesting companies, young companies that are involved in COVID-related activities. Gary Lauder is a experienced veteran, you might say, venture capitalist and technology investor in Silicon Valley. And finally, Dan Brown, a successful inventor and entrepreneur with 40+ patents. Dan's a professor of engineering design at Northwestern, and he's inventor of the InstaShield, which he can tell you more about in a little while, but InstaShield, I think, sold 800,000 pieces, 200,000 of which were given away. And I'm sure he can tell you more about that. Let's start off with Adam. Adam?
Thank you, Bruce.
Are you there, Adam?
Yep, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Well, it's always good to start with the professor, get the castles in the clouds a discussion out of the way, and then you can get down to the brass tacks of what the real world innovators and business persons and policymakers are doing. But I'm very happy to be here today and honored to be representing the CIPU as a panelist, as a board member. My area of specialization, of course, is intellectual property, and luckily I'll be able to riff off of some of the earlier remarks by Danny in the last panel. COVID-19 has brought patents and patent policy back into mainstream discussions in a very dramatic way. There's always been some policy wonks and those of us who care about these issues, but now you have New York Times op-eds and others talking about the role of patents and the role that patents serve in the facilitation development of drugs and diagnostic tests and, of course, vaccines. And unfortunately, a lot of this discussion about the role of patents, particularly as we develop responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, is particularly as we're talking about the evolution of the diagnostic tests for our contact and tracing requirements, and ultimately, hopefully, a vaccine that is currently under development by several companies, is rather impoverished, and it really rests upon, I think, a foundational misunderstanding about the role of patents as property rights in the innovation economy and how it facilitates not just invention, but the commercialization and distribution of vital remedies and treatments and cures to consumers in the healthcare market and to the world generally. And of course, this is implicated in our understandings and sometimes an impoverished understanding, I believe, of what patent policy actually requires of innovators and firms working in the innovation industries. And so as part of the response to COVID-19, I think that a COVID-19 world requires a better IP literacy among the public and among policymakers. And hopefully people will become more informed about intellectual property and the vital role that it serves in our life in driving an innovation economy and creating a flourishing society. Now, at root, a lot of people understand what the role that patents serve in kind of a very conventional way, normally framed up as a trade-off between kind of, well, we want to incentivize people to create, and so we dangle a monopoly in front of them, the patent, and of course, so we are trading off the gains from these inventions, these new creations that are disclosed through the patents, as Danny very eloquently described, against the losses of access from locking up the innovation for a short period of time in this monopoly grant, right? I think this was kind of captured a little bit implicitly in Chris and Danny's discussion, where they talked about the balance between open versus closed approaches. And in fact, we saw this immediately in response to COVID-19 when people were talking about the responses in the healthcare industry more generally. The responses among many activists and policymakers was immediately to say people should give up their patents, and there should be no patents on vaccines, and there should be no patents on drugs that treat COVID-19. And again, because the assumption is patents are a blockade, they're a tax on innovation and on access. But patents are not a monopoly interest, they're not a monopoly grant, they're a property right. And like all property rights, they are a platform for innovation, not just invention, but innovation in the marketplace. They facilitate commercial exchanges and investments in infrastructure, both at the research and development stage and in the development of business models, I think as Danny described very well. I mean, of course, it drives investment, and venture capitalists rely upon patents. We see this every day, every week in Shark Tank. Serves as collateral for investments, makes possible licensing and other types of activities in the marketplace that facilitates the efficient distribution of products and services to everyone, especially and is highly exemplified by our smartphones, which are actually, the smartphone industry is the most patent-intensive industry in the world, in human history. And yet it represents some of the fastest innovative developments, the quickest entry of new products and services, and surprisingly to many people, although not to me, some of the fastest quality adjusted price reductions over time that we have seen in the history of modern capitalism. So we know today that that COVID-19 is not going to be a repeat of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1917, in which approximately 50 million people died around the globe. And that is because the biopharmaceutical industry has sprung into action, as Danny described it earlier a little bit. And the reason they've been able to do this is because of this principle about patents as serving as a platform, as a facilitator of development and communication, applies in all aspects of the innovation economy, especially to the biopharmaceutical industry. And the examples of this are profound and are and just to give you one small example of this, there are right now currently over 700 drugs, diagnostic tests, and vaccines currently under development or testing in clinical trials for deployment against the COVID-19 virus. And this is really significant, right? I mean, this is unheralded. This has never happened. This is unprecedented response from an entire sector of our economy to an immediate condition. And there's, as Danny described, and it's true, there's been incredible amounts of information sharing between and amongst firms in the biopharmaceutical sector, as well as cooperation through licensing agreements and other types of commercial exchanges. And all of this has been made possible given the extensive research and development and commercial infrastructure that has been created over the past 4 decades, and hundreds of billions, if not ultimately trillions of dollars that have been invested in creating this infrastructure. And this was all done on the basis of reliable and effective property rights, patents in these new innovative healthcare treatments, which have made modern life in the 21st century a veritable miracle by historical standards. And we know that patents have served this important role. The United States led the world, starting with the very famous Supreme Court decision, Diamond v. Chakrabarty in 1981, that said that genetically engineered byproducts of research and development are patentable, even if they may be alive. And while the rest of the world balked at protecting these types of innovations, the United States took the lead in saying you can do this. Venture capital immediately flowed into this. You had immediate spin-offs from universities through the Bayh-Dole Act, creating massive amount of development and creating our modern biotech revolution. And this is really important. Yes.
One more minute.
Yep. This is really important because the average R&D behind every drug approved by the Federal Drug Administration is $2.6 billion and represents approximately 10 to 15 years of testing and development. I mean, in fact, generally, every FDA-approved drug represents initially 10,000 molecules that were tested by a particular company or a researcher. That was eventually reduced down to 250 compounds that were approved for clinical testing, of which then 5 compounds make it through the just phase 3 clinical testing, of which then 1 is finally approved for the market. And so we have to have a better understanding of the legal and economic function of patents as platforms for innovation, especially for commercial development. And stop blaming barriers to access on platforms. Patents become the easy go-to whipping horse for these types of concerns when there are many other regulatory barriers that exist, such as the FDA and its approval requirements for new PPE, for testing materials, and for drugs themselves. And so there are many access issues. They are not all caused by the patent system, and in fact, in very many ways, they are not reducible to the patent system at all. And so I'm looking forward to a more robust, vibrant discussion about how we are developing these ways of responding to COVID-19 along with intellectual property. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That was very interesting. Terrific intro. Rhonda, you're up next. Your introductory remarks, please.
Oop, Rhonda, I think you're muted.
There we go. Hello. I'm so
Hey,
sorry. I am trying to share my screen. There we go. Okay, so I just want to give you guys a few examples of how our students have been coping with this, relying on their training as well as the cognitive agility of the young. So back when I was in business school in the olden days, every entrepreneurship class ended with a 500-page business plan. These business plans were obsolete the minute you walked out of the door. So the reason I am no longer a serial entrepreneur and am back at Haas teaching entrepreneurship is because we found ways to do this better. And that's really exciting. So I want to start with one example. Our signature accelerator event, it's a 3-month program, and the most exciting event of the whole year is our launch-a-thon, where we fan out across all 10 UC campuses and find folks to come to campus, help us build one wish list item over a weekend in a hackathon for our 24 accelerator teams. Well, this year's was scheduled for March 14th. Campus closed on March 10th. So we had 4 days to get this online, and even while our students were moving out of their dorms, we said the show must go on. So we used the mantra, we dug deep into our training and used the mantra, focus on your customers must have right now product. Whether or not it has anything to do with what you've been planning, focus on what your customers need right now. So an example, Dispatch Goods, their tagline is more tasty, less wasty. They have reusable food containers for takeout food and written up in the Wall Street Journal, gotten a lot of press. They were due to start on the 17th of March, a huge trial with Yelp and some other corporate customers. Well, people didn't go to work, that went out the door. So they focused on their customers must have right now product, which, as you will remember when all this started, hand sanitizer. Nobody could find hand sanitizer. So they leveraged their dishwashing facilities that they rented. They leveraged their vans that they had also signed leases for, and teamed up with a partner who had a distillery. So they were immediately able to pivot to hand sanitizer in 2 days. Pretty amazing. Second company was a CBD infused boba company that was supposed to start a big trial at USC on the 17th. That went away, so they took their supply of CBD and turned it into hand sanitizer, built a Shopify app, and were shipping product by the evening of the 16th. This is a face you'll all recognize from last night, but the two ladies on either side are launch alums. They are both CEOs of successful companies, but what they found was the problem about getting masks from people who had them in their garages or had stockpiled them for other reasons to frontline healthcare workers. So they started a very simple matching platform using the infrastructure from their companies called Mask Match. They've now matched around 1 million folks to exchange their mask, and they've been all over the press. Oops, sorry. And then finally, another alum company, Kite, door-to-door car rentals. With the leisure market torpedoing, they immediately had to pivot to who had the problem right now, and that was healthcare workers deploying to hotspots. So they pivoted their company quickly. And then as we moved into pandemic 2.0, where we were all forced to stay at home, this created some other opportunities for companies. This is also a launch company. It's a team of UCLA undergraduates that develops an app that sits on top of Slack and helps you communicate better with your teammates. So for instance, you have a teammate that likes just the facts, don't email me after 9 p.m. Kona can help you figure that out. And then another alum found that all of their friends were selling their cars because they no longer needed to commute, and they were buying more micro-mobility solutions. So they found that their friends were having problems finding out, well, which one should I buy? There's no real good source for information. So Ride Panda started their platform and wants to be the nerd wallet of micro-mobility. Another company, Saren, this is a current MBA student, is seeking to replicate spontaneous water cooler conversation. And they are getting a lot of takers because for certain segments, there are lots of folks who really miss that ability to just run into their coworkers. And here's another one of our teams. This is an evening weekend MBA student who recently went through our National I-Corps program. She had developed a precision healthcare platform to help folks receive healthcare and track symptoms and do a number of other things for chronic conditions. What she's finding now is that the biggest chronic condition that's growing now is what they're terming long haulers. These are folks who have had COVID and recovered from an antibody standpoint, but they are still experiencing symptoms, much like for other chronic conditions like Lyme. So, and one final thought I want to leave you with is, sorry, let me turn off. Sorry. Oops. Let me just click through this. So, oops. Basically, I want to share my screen. How can I continue doing that? So, this was a way of looking to history for solutions. And let me just turn off the sound so you can see what I'm talking about. This is a designer. I read about this last week in Vogue and I got so excited. So he looked to what designers did after World War II when they no longer had the supplies they needed. They couldn't travel, their customers couldn't travel to Paris for the fashion shows. These designers took their show on the road using marionettes. So it goes back to Bruce's talk about sometimes the solutions are low tech. But it's a great opportunity for us to continue looking at training, cognitive agility, as well as history and creativity. And it raises the question and the importance of bringing diverse voices and diverse perspectives, because we have a lot of problems to solve, and we're gonna need everybody's help to do it. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Rhonda. That was terrific. Very interesting. We'll get back to, I have some questions about that. We'll get back to that later. Gary Lauder, you're up next. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Let me just find the screen and share it. Okay. So making the best of the worst. Let's see, one sec. Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be sharing the stage with Dan Brown, who's one of my heroes. These are of some eclectic topics that do hang together. So I strive to make all of my presentations novel, useful, and non-obvious, as I do with my patents, of which I have about 16 or 17 issued. Lots to cover. So I tend to use a style that is based on the premise that since one can read much faster than one can listen, and you can listen faster than most people actually speak, and since spare mental cycles tend to lead people to do multitasking, and which leads to lower retention, I'll try to use up those spare cycles and rely on the Doppler effect, which is the tendency of stupid ideas to seem smarter when they come at you rapidly. So I'm a venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley, invested over $500 million over the past 35 years in over 140 companies directly and separately in over 100 venture capital funds. A lot of the problems are a function of muddled thinking. And we had information about SARS, but we did not have the trauma and scar tissue that the Asian countries did. So, and it's also the case that we and other Western countries don't respond properly to early emergence of threats that are known to grow exponentially. So obviously the epidemic and pandemic is the case that we're talking about now, but it's also the case for wildfires. We could use lightning detection and drones with thermal cameras to identify fires right at the outset and hit them early and hard, but we don't, even though that would be vastly more economically beneficial. The same analogy goes with pandemics. And more muddled thinking has all sorts of adverse consequences. So for example, there have been accusations of price gouging and profiteering against sellers of N95 masks, particularly early in the pandemic. And this was based on a failure to understand the supply curve, which is that when the demand and therefore the price goes up for a good, then the supply tends to increase for it. There was hostility towards N95 wearers as if they deprived hospital workers of them. And we have underutilization of sterilization for reuse of protective of PPE. This can be done with UV light and with chemical sterilizers. And the failure to recognize that COVID was aerosol, despite plenty of evidence March and earlier, and the natural consequences are that we need to aggressively ventilate and do things outdoors. Although obviously winter's coming, so we better figure this out quickly. So there's another cause of market failure, which is the absence of IP protection and the profit motive that causes under-promotion of free and inexpensive solutions. So for example, vitamin D results in 54% reduction in likelihood of getting COVID at all. And it also results in you're becoming about half as likely to die of it. And that's among hospitalized people. In other words, when they sampled people who went into the hospital for their vitamin D levels, those that were lowest were twice as likely to die. So, and that's just of people who went into the hospital, who were hospitalized. If I don't know what the statistic is in the general population, but I think your likelihood of hospitalization is dramatically less as well. So that this understates the efficacy. Despite that, and despite the fact that the sun is free, pills are cheap, and it's more effective than remdesivir, we don't hear as much as we do about remdesivir. So anyway, and let me just emphasize, so this is exemplary of why the communist notion that patents should be done away with, and that then we'll have kumbaya, is just the completely false premise, because in the absence of the incentives, the profit incentives, you don't have even adequate promotion of those things that are already known as safe. In the absence of those incentives, you obviously wouldn't have the funding to do trials to determine if something is safe in the first place. So anyway, I already talked about re-sterilization of PPE, and another example of a cheap solution is it has been found that if you take a surgical mask, which generally is made of the same materials as an N95 mask, and you tie 3 rubber bands together and place them as shown in the diagram, that is as effective as an N95 mask. But however, it's not proprietary, so no one promoted that enough for it to be part of the general knowledge. So the folks who figured that out then came up with a proprietary and new and improved giant elastic mask holder. It's available at fixthemask.com. But anyway, that's just another example. So another life-saving mask that we would all like to see applied more often is this one. But anyway, so I'm going to shed some light on UVGI. That's ultraviolet germicidal irradiation. That UVC, ultraviolet C, is the far UV, which does not make it through the atmosphere. The sun emits it, but it doesn't get through the atmosphere to the surface of the Earth. You can get it from mercury vapor lamps, which emit at 254 nanometers. Nanometers are a measure of the wavelength of the light. LEDs emit over a wide wavelength, including in the UVC range, and excimer lamps at 222. It disrupts the DNA or the RNA by causing the two adjacent thymine bases. In the diagram on the right, you can see that the red thymines are bound together because when a photon hits that, it can cause them to bind with each other, which gums up the replication of DNA or RNA, which prevents that virus. It would deactivate that virus and render it unable to replicate. So over 80 years ago, this was done in public schools in Philadelphia, and it showed that upper room ultraviolet fixtures could significantly reduce the transmission of measles among students. So it's in the upper room because that wavelength is damaging to the skin and eyes, but those wavelengths don't reflect much from paint, and that's why it was safe to shine on the ceiling and not have to worry about it bouncing back into people's skin and eyes. After the measles vaccine, this was mostly forgotten. One can still buy this, but it's not adequately talked about, and it could be key for reopening schools. I've made some investments in several companies that are potentially helpful. So one company is Curative. This is the only one of these that I invested for COVID. They do now about 10% of all the tests in the United States. Nanotics is a company I invested in to cure cancer, and they have created nanoparticles that rapidly absorb cytokines, which are a key component of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the main thing people die of when they have COVID. And so by absorbing those cytokines, it can arrest ARDS and prevent ARDS. It turns out that after SARS, many people who got SARS were left with a long-term condition basically equivalent to chronic fatigue syndrome. And this company, Cortine, is developing a cure for chronic fatigue syndrome. And so, and that would be a pre-existing condition after people have it. So, and Soleus is a company that's developing a UVB light source to synthesize vitamin D in people's skin and other good photochemicals. And it's actually better to get one's vitamin D from the sun or from light than from just pills. And it's not yet on the market, but hopefully next year. Although they are improved in Canada, so if you're in Vancouver, there's a place to find it. But anyway, and then last is a company named Heal, which doctors that make house calls and take insurance, of which there are many such companies. And the existence of COVID makes people a lot less eager to go into the doctor's waiting room. So we all hope with everyone's efforts, we will get rid of this virus. And I look forward to any questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gary. That's terrific. A question: are those your investments, or are they just companies that you're familiar with?
Yeah, those are only my investments. There are tons of other investments that have addressed various angles of this, but these are just mine.
Great. Okay, thank you. Finally, batting cleanup, we have Dan Brown, inventor and professor at Northwestern of Design. Dan.
Hello. So I'm proud to be here. Thanks for the shout out, Gary. That makes me feel pretty special. I'm going to tell a bit of a war story that sort of maybe ties a lot of this together, and then end with some concerns. But to make it, I think, relevant, I guess I'm going to give a little background. I am a full-time professor for now 10 years at Northwestern. I didn't come to be a professor out of school. I went and worked in industry for years and developed a lot of products and had a fair amount of success, developed very strong skills in design. And then at 50, I wanted to go back and get my master's. So I got my master's here at Northwestern in product development. A few years later, I started teaching part-time and then came full-time. What allowed me to do that is I had started a company my son runs, and he's part of this story, so I mentioned him. And went back and to get my PhD, and got my PhD when I was 60. So I pretty much tell people I've got a lot of practical experience and a bit of a slow learner. So, but the situation that I'm going to discuss with you today is first, what allowed me to come back. I had developed a product called the Bionic Wrench. It's a little bit of a free commercial, but that has a tag into the end of the story. And the Bionic Wrench is a bit of a case study for a process I call differentiation by design. And I believe that a design can create value, can create a competitive advantage. We could leverage it more from just individual profits, but more of a conscious capitalism. So it's been made in America. Everybody told me I couldn't do it. We launched it in 2005. We sold about 3 million of them, all 100% American made, competing against products all coming from offshore sources. So let's fast forward. My son's running this business. He's entrepreneurial, very much a marketing guy. And my son, Dan, when the coronavirus was hitting, he was on this big time. And I'm hearing about it all the time. In January, February, he's escalating this. And we're getting the predictions that if this comes to the States and it scales, it could be millions of people in hospitals. We're just not prepared for it. We see ships going into New York and all this going on. And at the same time, I'm the director of the shops here at Northwestern. We have rapid prototype machines, and everybody's calling me and saying, hey, can we make masks and shields on the rapid prototype machines? And I said, yes, we can, but we can't make millions of them. It won't scale. And as we're going back and forth, and my son prodded me a bit, he often thinks he's my boss, we started reconciling the problem. And he said, well, why can't you do that? And I said, well, you know, the headgear that goes around shields basically has a lot of components, and they tend to be injection molded, and that tooling then takes 3-4 months at times to make. And to be able to scale it and in this short amount of time, it won't work. And he said, you know, we have to find a way to be able to scale this, to get to it. And my design thinking process or whatever is, you know, you need a shield, but do you need the headgear? And as I refocused on the problem, I thought, what if I could use a baseball cap? Everybody has baseball caps, they're comfortable. Could I attach a shield to a baseball cap? And that really caused me to shift my thinking a bit. I knew that I could stamp out shields in production processes that I've been familiar with for years that can scale. We can make millions of them quickly. And my son and I began designing this. And I started working on creating a way to have a shield that would fit onto a baseball cap that could scale, fast tooling, et cetera. And lo and behold, within 6 weeks, we were in production. And we have per machine that can run this, a capacity of over 50,000 shields per day. And that allows you, in a sort of a franchise type situation, the ability to create a lot of shields that you can get out there at a very low cost and have them fit onto a baseball cap, which everybody has, and you can have a face shield. This allows the users the option of using a mask and a shield. We didn't know at the time how the transmission was going to take place, but it was just a real challenge to think that you're going to have all these frontline workers and not enough shields out there. And so we designed this. My son invested his own money into it, and we scaled it. And it said earlier we sold about 800,000 and gave 200,000 away. We've actually sold over 1 million now, and my son's given over 250,000 away in an awareness type strategy of getting face shields to frontline workers, to students that can't afford them, and elderly people that are a higher risk. And you know, so this is, you know, sort of turned around. Now, we didn't have to send out millions of them as we had thought, but we were there. We were ready to do it. We could do it. There was a lot of challenges, though.
Excuse me, Dan, is your mask proprietary at all under trade?
Yeah, so we have 3 design patents and 1 patent pending. I'll talk about that from a utility patent, because let's face it, if you can't get a patent, who's going to take the risk? And not only was the tooling a risk, because there was a supply, this is PET, the same material that your water bottle's made out of, because I wanted it to be, you could take it off and recycle it, or you could actually, this is 3 times thicker than a normal shield, you can actually sterilize it. I didn't want to create mounds of waste in the waste stream, because that doesn't make any sense. Didn't have to do that. But the shield then allowed us to scale it, but my son had to commit 6 figures and more right off the bat, just to have raw material to come in 2 and 3 weeks later. There was no backstop to it. He took a naked risk on this. Had we not had been able to get patents, which I'm fairly adept at getting patents and understanding what the lay of the land was. No one has done this with a baseball cap before. He wouldn't have been able to take that risk. We didn't have any government money or anything like that. This is a pure entrepreneurial move. So the question comes down to the situation here of being able to do this and respond rapidly, which there was a solution here very quick for shields, is what's the new normal, old normal relationship. When I reflected back on this, sure, there's going to be a new normal, I think, of us wearing masks and other types of PPE, and we see it now. You saw Andy Reid with his shield and his game that got all fogged up. By the way, wasn't our shield. If they had designed it with the proper ventilation, it wouldn't have fogged up. But it was more of a hockey shield that totally covered his face. But we have NFL teams contacting us now. Our own team here at Northwestern, Coach Fitz, has been wearing a shield. They wear shields during walkthrough. But the reflection that I have is that from an entrepreneur, a designer, an inventor, this new normal is the same as the old normal. I have the same concerns as, well, one, is this going to be just a pop-up opportunity and disappear? To mitigate that, my son's working on going in other adjacent areas. We're looking at bringing shields out in retail. So when you paint your ceiling, you're not going to ruin your glasses and those type of things. But if the opportunity disappears as fast as it came, you know, what's going to be left? Is there going to be a lot of bills to be paid? Fortunately, I think we're going to be okay now. Will we get our patents in time to protect our designs? Because I showed you the bionic wrench. I've got a great war story. I won a trial where we had 2 defendants found willfully infringing our patents, and which is very challenged to win. So that's fantastic. Only to have the judge change the terminology that the lawsuit was litigated under, and not certify the jury verdict. So it's crazy. And so you're in a situation, you spend all this money, this investment. I'm really concerned now, you know, Dan's got his investment out there. If we can't protect the knockoffs, which are coming in the marketplace, how do you have that incentive that Adam Mossoff talked about very, very well he articulated also, that if people aren't willing to do this, even without government help, and be able to protect your investment, it becomes a cannibalistic system. And we have this crazy situation in our country where every election cycle, everybody's calling for innovation to create jobs and create more tax base. But the reality is we have an efficient infringement model where people like us, small companies particularly, because it's very expensive to go through this litigation, get knocked off all the time because the people that knock you off do not get held accountable. And this is the same problem post-COVID that I experienced pre-COVID. And my reflection is, you know, how can we sustain an American-made business model if what we allow is just cannibalism of those new ideas that we're all asking for immediately in the process? We need reform in the patent office. We need reform in the court system. We need our legislators to start looking at the root cause of a lot of our social problems, which is we've lost a lot of good jobs. So I sort of, I guess that's my time. I didn't keep track of my time, but I think I may went over.
A little bit, but it was worth it.
Okay.
Thank you all. And so now some questions for the panel. You covered so much that, you know, you preempted some of my questions, but recently, some of there's evidence that some tech companies outside of the big five are benefiting from. There's an article in the New York Times that said that that tech in general, or certain areas of tech, have done extremely well. Stocks have done well, and this is beyond the big five, because of anticipated COVID-related progress. Do you see this as a trend, panel? Anyone in particular? Gary, particularly you. Do you see more investment, significant, serious investment in COVID-related tech, or tech that can address COVID issues and impact? Gary?
Well, with respect to that question, of course, before COVID there wasn't any, so there's a lot more. I don't know that there's more investing now than there had been before, but it is not tracking the overall economy insofar as it's not down like much of the economy. Regarding the first part of your question, I didn't really understand that question regarding the New York Times article and so forth. Can you
Well, the
elaborate?
Times had said, I mean, the S&P 500, I think 58% of the S&P 500 gain was attributed to 5 companies over the last 2 or 3 months, or maybe longer. And the Times said that recently, companies have shown 70, 80, 90% gains. Some less well-known companies, definitely less well-known. And they attribute that to the anticipation that these companies will play a role in office life, work life type of solutions that will address COVID. Do you sense that that's catching on, or is that still in its infancy?
Well, there are definitely various sectors which are now booming as a result of COVID. I mean, and a lot of things that one would have had to have really sort of thought through the second and third order effects to have anticipated. You know, Zoom is one. Companies that make outdoor heaters for restaurants to serve outside. I mean, there's a number of niches that, and you know, obviously Amazon is not a niche. So I mean, so clearly there are winners and there are losers in this. But overall, I think we all would have preferred for things to have been the way they were rather than have this new order of things. But anyway, it is what it is, and anticipating correctly what it's going to be is always a challenge for investors. But I try.
Adam, I know this is an area that you're interested in. I spoke with Daniel Gerstein earlier, so is he. Belgium announced today a contact tracing app that it will be using, similar to the one in Germany, and not that dissimilar from the Google Apple contact tracing that is being done. That's a double-edged sword. And can you give us some thoughts about the use of those sorts of solutions?
Certainly. And by the way, these contact tracing apps are an excellent example of how we can use our technology, particularly an unforeseen benefit of the mobile revolution. I mean, the mobile revolution in its entirety, from the gig economy upwards, are largely unforeseen and unpredicted benefits. I myself have a contact and tracing app for Northern Virginia on mine that was made available by the Virginia public authorities because I've embraced the attitude of millennials and Gen Xers that privacy, we really don't have it anymore. but for many other people of our generation, and that we do have some concerns about privacy, and understandably so, especially as you mentioned, Google and Apple and many others of the big tech Silicon Valley companies, as we've discovered over the past several years, that all of those claims that they have been making for the past 10 or 15 years about how, oh, they're respecting our data, they're not commoditizing our data, they're keeping it, they're respecting us, that this has all been not true, and that this has actually driven, I believe, a lot of legitimate concerns about what they have been doing and the market power that they have acquired through the use of the information that we have willingly given up to them in exchange for the use of their services, but nonetheless, willingly given up under terms that were not necessarily clear to us as to what would actually be happening with that data. And so I think that people who have these concerns now and are legitimate will be equally concerned about these contact and tracing apps, especially if the contact and tracing apps are deployed through the same companies that have been shown to be less than trustworthy about our actual data itself.
There's
Ron?
one.
Sure.
If I could just add something with.
Sure.
It's not that well known that the reason why the Surgeon General has this name, has the militaristic name General and an actual military uniform, is that in the olden days, the only way to deal with pandemics was to force people to quarantine. And it is the case that when there are such enormous externalities of individual behavior, that it is in society's best interest to coerce people into doing things that they may not voluntarily do, and this it has that type of technique has not been needed for about a century, and consequently, other than saying you can't come to school unless your kid's vaccinated. But the fact is that there are things that the government may need to impose to try to make all people safe. The issue is, can the government, in the process of doing so, engender enough trust to not be distrusted as to the misuse of this data? But people are inherently freer as a result of this disease will be freer as a result of this disease being behind us. So some sacrifice of one's extreme privacy views is probably necessary to bring that about.
Great, thank you. Rhonda, your students, an alumni that developed these very interesting companies and did so quickly, were they funded at all internally by Berkeley or externally?
No, not at all. The accelerator program that we run is funded by sponsors, but they don't have anything other than their ability to go connect with customers and apply the fundamentals.
Mm-hmm. So they didn't receive seed money or anything from anyone, or?
No, some of them have gone on to get grants and seed funding, but at that time, it was part of a program where it really is just a training program.
And was anything proprietary that came out of it that they could use or license?
That's a great question. I think some of the more software intensive ones like Sarin and Isla and Psych, I think there are some patents around that, but the other things, no.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dan Brown, you mentioned pop-up industries. What do you have a sense of what might be considered a pop-up industry or what might be enduring? I know it's a little hard. You have to put on your prognosticator's cap, but what industries do you have a sense will be around for a while and what perhaps may not with regard to COVID and COVID management?
That sure puts on, wondering how long COVID will be here. But I actually learned the pop-up medical company as we went to get product liability insurance. And because the product can be used as a medical type product, even though it's not that sophisticated and surely not new to use face shields. We had to find, obviously, suppliers that had the manufacturing certified so they meet the FDA requirements. The type of raw material had to be a certain quality and grade and that. But even when we had all that worked out, and I'm pretty good at this stuff and had the specifications down and the forms filled out properly, product liability insurers were hesitant to jump in and give us product liability insurance. And I can tell you, the first year of product liability insurance is really sort of a shot in the dark for the company, so they charge you a lot. When we got the product liability insurance for the bionic wrench, for the shield, the product liability insurance, the cheapest one we can get, was almost 10 times higher per year. Because companies don't know what the risk is.
Right.
You can't run out there and go out without product liability. It's tough. So the risk is really deep in this chain, and when it happens, I guess a pop-up company is something like we are. I mean, we saw a problem and we reacted quickly to it, and it popped up. They sort of refer like the Halloween stores and the malls, but we're
Right.
looking for a long-term
What-
type investment. We invested in trademarks and trade dress and developed the websites and everything to build a brand around this. And that's why, sorry.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I guess once upon a time, Amazon was a pop-up company.
Yeah, right. Anybody that's in a new area is a pop-up company.
Right. Interesting. Okay. I'm going to do one more question. I don't know if are there any in the queue, Chris, for us, or not really?
There was one from very early from James Conley for Dan Brown. I think Dan may have addressed part of it already, but yeah, the question was if you could speak about how a private innovator can organize to put forward COVID PPE solutions using modern manufacturing with or without government support.
Yeah, well, government support is nice because they're backstopping your risk of cash loss or investment loss. But I just don't know how that plays out. And my gut feel that a lot of this money that went into a lot of investments by the government probably wasn't always well spent, because I don't know that there's a cause and effect when you have exposure as far as risk, and you make sure you do things the right way. I think that, to go back to my reflection, we have to stop this efficient infringement. There's several members on the panel here. I see Adam shaking his head, and I don't think the world is aware of the cannibalistic nature of our current system and how far we've departed from the rights of inventors and the spirit that built this country. And I can get, for a half the price, a bionic wrench sent from Shenzhen, China, to my home in Evanston here for about $10. It's crazy. I can't get them for $10 and pay a fair price. And not only is it violating my intellectual property, I mean, it's exact. They put it in exact packaging at times. We're subsidizing that shipment with our U.S. Postal Service. We give them favored rates. It's cheaper for me to buy something and get it from Shenzhen to my place in Evanston than it is from the Pittsburgh area where the wrenches are made to Evanston. It doesn't make any sense. And I don't know how to get this awareness out to the public. I mean, I try as hard as I can, but unless we get this root cause problem solved, we're not going to be building good jobs. We're not going to be doing things that are important to society. I don't care what ideology you have. Everybody can agree on the best social system is a good job. And we just need to deal with this as a fundamental problem in society.
Anyone else on the panel have anything to add to that? It's very well put.
Amen.
Yeah. Amen. 1/3 or more of Americans are unwilling to take a COVID-19 vaccine, or said they were in a survey, which is likely to be less than 70% effective. Suspicion of science will not help managing the pandemic, obviously. Is there something that we should be doing better?
Respecting science and scientists.
I mean,
Well, how do we create that?
The problem of vaccine skepticism and the type of conspiracy-based theories, like that the COVID vaccine would have a chip in it from Bill Gates is something I've seen, and the general conspiracy theories about vaccines from long before the pandemic, I mean, persist. I mean, and pandemics won't make them go away. Unfortunately, they bring them more to the forefront, so I think it's a more general problem with ensuring better literacy, not just about intellectual property and about the way that the innovation economy functions, but general literacy about science and technology, as Gary and as mentioned, and Rhonda is nodding her head. That these are incredible innovations that work, that are products of the incredible discoveries of and labors of inventors and innovators over the past 120 years. I mean, it's sometimes we forget today, how relatively recent all of our modern medicine is. I mean, Gary mentioned how, historically, quarantines were the response to pandemics. Well, that was because, we didn't have antibiotics until the 1920s and 30s, until the development of certain chemicals. I mean, a story I often like to tell is, President Coolidge's son, 16-year-old son, died in 1924 because he injured his big toe playing tennis on the front lawn of the White House. And then he got a blood infection, and there weren't any antibiotics to treat his blood infection, and he died 7 days later. I mean, this is shocking to us, but this is less than 100 years ago. My response is all, we need to have better literacy, but we still are very much in the origins, in the beginning of this incredible revolution, and the hope is that as we continue to move forward, there'll be people who will less take it for granted, and there'll be people who less reject it and engage in fear mongering about where it's from.
I agree 100% with Adam about raising the literacy. This is something, when I started my career in biotech, I helped one of my MIT professors start a company as an undergrad. I've always worried about this, the delta between what the average person understands about science and then what we are capable of delivering to them. I also feel like we have to meet people where they are, though. So this means more, Bill Nye the Science Guy, more on TV, more on Facebook. We've got to find a way to get this into their heads. It's not optimal, some of the ways, but we really do need to do whatever it takes to raise that literacy.
Yeah, I would also, I'd also add that if we are not in a position to compel people to take vaccines against their will, we can, with legitimate reasons, deny people who don't have a vaccine proof of having had the vaccine, deny them access to stores and restaurants and movie theaters and public transportation and things like that. And I mean, one is entitled to one's opinions, and if they want to stay home and just have all their food delivered and so forth, then people should have that right, but they shouldn't have the right to go out and infect the subset of the population that can't get vaccines for medical reasons.
Does our experience with COVID/science, or lack of awareness of science and slow response to the pandemic crisis, does that impact how we see, do you think, how we see climate change? Will climate change perhaps improve as a result of this experience, or do you think they're totally separate? Anyone? Gary, you have an interest, I know.
Well, the subject is complicated. I mean, insofar as the pandemic might increase the likelihood of a change of presidency in November, then that would help climate change. I think I would be hard pressed to draw a connection between COVID causing more respect for science and the more respect for science causing more belief in the issue of climate change. It's possible. That's just I wouldn't bet on that nexus, but I hope for it.
This is Charlie Cicchetti. I'd like to jump in if I could, because I've written and thought a lot about the issue of climate change and COVID and how they go together. And the one observation I would make is that we actually, at least in recent time, undermined how people understand science when we started to politically say the science proved man caused climate change or man caused global warming. That kind of goes right in the face of what science is all about. It's about testing hypotheses. It's about explaining the probabilities and the degree of certainty we have. And when we start saying that science is what somebody who calls themselves a scientist says, which is their opinion, as opposed to what science does, we get ourselves in the trouble that we're in today with respect to both COVID and climate change. We made politicians use science, and scientists have done a poor job of pushing back and saying, no, you can't do that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying A, B, and C. I'm not saying what you're trying to get me to say or use me to say. And I think some of it might have been because the people who were being quoted or used or relied on were getting in the spotlight for the first time. And maybe they thought that that was a way to improve their access to the public and explain things. But I think they've been misused and misappropriated by politicians on both sides. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it now. We're living with it. And nobody's really pushing back on it because either that's not what we do. We're not debaters in a political sense. But it is how we're being misrepresented and misused. And I think there's a need to at least understand that. And at a minimum, explain it to our students as opposed to, we can't explain it to everybody else out there.
So I have a thought on, the big picture here is that I don't know if we can take a magic wand and change the literacy and understanding of these complex issues to people. But I do think we have a fundamental problem that our politicians are lifelong politicians, and they're not scientists for the most part. They're lawyers or who knows where they come from. But the reality is we're asking them to deal with these complex issues. And I don't think they have the wherewithal to really do the critical thinking to sort out the problems. And then they have to get elected every year. So they're pandering to these special interests that are funding that. And we have this vicious cycle of continually doing foolish things, and it changes with the wind every so many elections, and I don't think we're gaining any ground. And just simple things like what the Chinese do with a 5-year program, right or wrong, whatever it is, just staying to a thing and plan and working at it is much more effective than this craziness we go through in our system.
Indeed, policy is innovation policy and IP policy seems to be lacking. Chris, any questions in the queue? Otherwise, unless the panel has a question for each other, I'm pretty much complete here and satisfied. Chris?
No, there are no questions in the queue, though I do have one that I hope the panelists can just quickly address before we sign out. On both our first and second panels, a number of you have backgrounds or connections with universities and being faculty members. I'm just wondering if maybe we could have a couple of you quickly address what are some of the roles that academia and the private sector or the public sector and the private sector can be partnering on in this era of COVID to really come up with these kind of innovative solutions that we've all been talking about.
Well, I could also, I know the hospitals and labs are totally engaged in all kinds of science related to the many aspects and complexities of the problem. So, I mean, that's a low-hanging fruit answer. We're working with, in our shops with the medical school, building components and doing things, adapting apparatuses so that the further research can get done or testing can get done. So, I mean, we're doing that right now. At a larger philosophical perspective, that's an interesting question, because I think we have to change the mindset of approaching these big systemic problems, whether it be COVID or whether it be climate change.
I mean, so the question of kind of the various public-private relationships and the relationships between the universities and the private sector more generally. These are really great and important questions. These types of relationships have been foundational to a lot of the innovation that has driven the innovation economy, both in the biopharmaceutical space and in the high-tech space. I mentioned very briefly in my opening remarks, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which is what has facilitated incredible, massive amounts, trillions of dollars of licensing of patents obtained on innovations that were conceived of by university researchers and even by graduate students. A lot of people don't know that Sergey Brin and Larry Page were graduate students at Stanford when they came up with their very first PageRank search algorithm, and they got a patent on it. And Stanford owns that patent, and Stanford has made about $300 million that it has been able to reinvest back into the research and that is done by its university, by its researchers, but also to provide scholarships and more access for educational opportunities to individuals. So not only has there been incredible tech innovation and deployment of that innovation through licensing deals and other commercial developments in the marketplace, but it redounds back to the universities and to the benefit of society. There is a lot of confusion though about a lot of these partnerships, because the NIH does fund some of the foundational research, some of the very, very far upstream basic research that does lead to eventually, after many hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars of further investments, to actual drugs and vaccines and other types of therapeutic treatments deployed in the healthcare sector. And so that has been a leverage point that a lot of activists have used to try to say, well, then the government should exercise what's called a marching power to step in and confiscate these drugs and vaccines and therapeutic treatments and deploy them itself to people directly. But there's a real profound misunderstanding here, because what the government ends up funding is as I mentioned, is the upstream foundational research. And it ends up actually funding very, very small, insignificant amounts of that, of the total amount of R&D money that's invested. In 2019, just to give you one small example, private sector investment in the biopharmaceutical industry was approximately $129 billion, which was by orders of magnitude, 4 times more than the total public sector investments made by NIH, which range between 30 to 40 billion. And as I indicated, many of that initial inquiries into those initial 10,000 molecules lead nowhere. And then even when they do lead somewhere, it's another many billions of dollars of further testing and development, including things like figuring out how to get a molecule that treats a particular antigen, a condition like COVID-19, past the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, which is a huge, profound problem. and then how to get it absorbed through your intestinal wall, and how to get it in your bloodstream without your own body's immune system attacking it as itself as an antigen. I mean, and this is why drug development is so expensive and takes so long, and is so incredible. I mean, when you think about what this innovative achievement is, when you kind of hold this full context of when you take your ibuprofen pill, or when you eventually will be taking your pill to treat, whether it's remdesivir if you have a severe condition with COVID-19, or whether we end up receiving the vaccine for COVID-19 that will eventually be developed probably by the end of this year. And so, these relationships should continue, and they're part and parcel of what, a lot of what's contributed to our incredible society we have today, our growing innovation economy, the jobs, and the flourishing lives that we all live. But we also need to have a real understanding and appreciation of what's really happening, what constitutes these relationships, and the actual contributions by innovators, from everyone from Dan Brown at Northwestern to the scientists at Pfizer and Merck and Moderna and other biopharmaceutical companies.
Adam, do you want to talk about Eroom's law?
Well, why don't you talk about it, since I learned about it from you? So
Okay.
it should come from the great teacher.
Well, I'm not the original source, but this is Moore's law spelled backwards, and I recommend you Google it. And it shows how the cost per drug approved by the FDA has been increasing on a logarithmic, if it's graphed on a semi-log scale, i.e. time on the horizontal and log of R&D dollars on the vertical scale. It is a pretty much, since the creation of the FDA, the costs have been growing exponentially. And when it was last done, I think the last data point I saw was like 2010, maybe. It was about $2.5 billion per drug approved by the FDA. And so there are many causes of this, and it's not just the FDA being more difficult. It's part of it is the so-called better than the Beatles phenomena, which is that it has to be better than what exists out there, and it's what exists is so good that it's hard to be better. And there's a lot of different factors. But it's worthy of familiarizing yourself with it, particularly when thinking about those who somehow think that these drugs will magically appear in the absence of strong intellectual property protections.
A great case study, if you want to read it, is Lyrica, which is a drug that was developed here at Northwestern, so I know about it. And the pathway that it went to marketplace, Northwestern made about $1 billion off it, and they keep looking for the next one. But the reality is, even our tech transfer office, the area, we call it INVO, that deals with these ideas that come out of the labs to bring to market, they're not that aggressive because they feel, it's a big risk to commercialize something, and they don't know if they're going to be able to protect it. They've got the same problem that small inventors have. They're risk adverse because of so much efficient infringement going on.
And that is a hidden cost that is hard to quantify because it's a bunch of individual decisions and that don't get reported on.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that IP represents the biggest untapped potential in universities. I mean, there's so much of it just sitting on the shelf. And one reason it's not being commercialized, people don't know how to. Tech transfer offices are understaffed. They can't investigate every single segment. I started a class, which I still teach, called Lean Transfer. We take IP that is sitting on the shelf from top inventors across Berkeley. I think this year we have Office of Naval Research. We've done NSA, Berkeley Labs, UCSF, and we use that as the basis to teach students the lean methodology, which is basically applying the scientific method to business. It's worked out really well because it helps our tech transfer office. It changes the mindset of inventors who learn how to think about it, and it helps to educate our students in a process without them having to have their own idea.
Great. Chris, anything else on your end?
No, I just want to thank everybody on the second panel and on both panels. I want to thank our audience, and I think it's really been a fascinating discussion. Really appreciate it. And also just to, as a last step, we are recording this panel, and we'll send out the link to everybody who registered and make it available. So hopefully it can have a second life and continue generating some more conversation.
Thank you, Chris. I'll second that. Thank you, panel, and thank you, audience, for staying with us. Many of you did have, as I see, and that's fantastic. You'll hear more from us about this topic, I'm sure. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
for organizing.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.